statue. Alleluia, 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 alleluia. One does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. Alleluia. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When Jesus heard of the death of John the Baptist, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place by himself. The crowds heard of this and followed him on foot from their towns. When he disembarked and saw the vast crowd, his heart was moved with pity for them, and he cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples approached him and said, "This is a deserted place, and it is already late. Dismiss the crowds that they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves." He said to them, "There is no need for them to go away. Give them some food yourselves." But they said to him, 5 loaves and 2 fish are all we have here." Then he said, "Bring them here to me." And he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he said the blessing, broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples, and in turn gave them to the crowds. They all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up the fragments left over, 12 wicker baskets full. Those who ate were about 5,000 men, not counting women and children. The Gospel of the Lord. Today is the feast of St. Alphonsus Liguori, a very exciting feast. It's my home parish of St. Alphonsus. I always think fondly on this feast of St. Alphonsus Liguori. St. Alphonsus Liguori is another one of those saints that is greatly neglected by the modern church, right? By many theologians and historians. If you've ever read any of St. Alphonsus's works, he was a very prolific writer. One of the things that stands out when you read St. Alphonsus is it almost seems like you're not even reading any of his thoughts. He basically is just always quoting different saints, right, and church fathers. But it's very, very good things to read. He's got a book on Mary called The Glories of Mary. He has a book on the Eucharist, on martyrs. He has a book on the priesthood. Highly recommend his writings. Now, what St. Alphonsus is most known for is he was the greatest moral theologian of his age and one of the greatest moral theologians in the history of the church. Many different popes basically proclaimed him as the moral theologian, right? Kind of the authority on moral theology in the church. Now, something I didn't know until this morning, right? Kind of always suspected this. I always wondered why in seminary, right? St. Alphonsus I knew that he was so proclaimed by the church. In fact, if I remember correctly, he was the saint who was most quickly made a doctor of the church, right? In the history of the church, right? So very much a proclaimed moral theologian. Now, out of curiosity, this morning I was actually looking up some of his moral theology books. And it turns out that it was not until just a couple of years ago that his moral theology was translated into English. And I was kind of struck by that. How is it that he's written so many different books that have been translated into English, perhaps the greatest moral theologian in all of church history? And yet all those years in the 1900s and 20th century, nobody bothered to translate his work into English. Why was that? I suspect, if you wanted to be pessimistic, you could say that many modern theologians are not interested in translating his work into English. Or you could just say that his greatness has been largely forgotten. I just point that out because it's another one of those examples that we need to be aware of, that oftentimes as modern Catholics, right, we have kind of some skewed views of theology and of history. And in my opinion, the fact that St. Alphonsus was never even translated into English is just another example of that. Moral theology is perhaps the greatest detriment that we experience as a church in the 20th century. Moral theologians, the quality of moral theologians is so poor compared to earlier ages in the church. In our modern age, we tend to look at moral theology and think that we know more than people who have come before us. I think St. Alphonsus is just another example of that, of a great teacher and wise man with a moral theology and morality who has been neglected in our modern age. Just simply point that out to you. More so, what I wanted to talk about this morning was this reading from the prophet Jeremiah. I mentioned to you before that Jeremiah, he was kind of a brother prophet to the prophet Ezekiel. They were both living during the same time, except for Ezekiel was one of the first Israelites to be taken off into exile. Right? So Jeremiah, all of his writings, all of his ministry was taking place in Jerusalem. Right? He was preaching before, during, and after the exile. So basically, as the Babylonians were coming in, Jeremiah was there that whole time, whereas Ezekiel was living in exile and seeing everything from afar, right? Kind of similar to St. John and his vision in the book of Revelation. He was in exile, witnessing things that were taking place in Jerusalem. And one of the messages of Jeremiah, again, he's sometimes called the weeping prophet, right? He was seen as a pessimist in his age. One of the things that he kept preaching to the people is that soon they were going to lose everything, that all the authorities living in Jerusalem in the temple, they wanted to say, it's going to be okay. God promised us all these different things. The temple's not going anywhere. The Babylonians are going to be taken over, right? It was false prophecy. And yet Jeremiah kept telling the people that the more they preached this peace, the worse the judgment was going to be on them. And he kept telling the people to stop resisting when the Babylonians did come in. They first came in, they carried a lot of the different things away from the temple, as we read about this morning. Right, this is one of the main messages of Jeremiah. And it made the people very upset, so much so that they actually threw him into a pit for the things that he was prophesying against Jerusalem and the temple. Might remind you of another famous prophet who was a celibate man like Jeremiah, who famously preached the condemnation of the temple in Jerusalem. It was Jesus, right? Jeremiah is a foreshadowing of him. Now, one of the most striking images of this is what we read from this morning, right? And it might be a little bit confusing what exactly was going on. Basically, Jeremiah was commanded by God as a symbolic and prophetic act to put a yoke around his neck, right? The kind of yoke you would put on an ox, right? And Jeremiah did this as a prefiguration of the fact that the people of Israel would be carried off into exile, right, as slaves. And he was telling the people that this was a foreshadowing. But some of the people there obviously didn't like it. Foremost among them was the prophet Hananiah, the false prophet Hananiah. And he was saying, surely in 2 years, right, God is going to take over the Babylonians and all the things that have been carried away into exile are going to be brought back. And Jeremiah resisted this message, calling him a false prophet of peace. And Hananiah, out of anger, took the yoke off of Jeremiah's shoulder and he smashed it on the ground because he couldn't stand it. And Jeremiah again resisted and told him he was wrong and prophesied that Hananiah, because of his false prophecies, was going to die that very same year, which is exactly what happened in the 7th month. I actually really love this story from the prophet Jeremiah because I think it is a great image of our own day. On TV channels, and you can read self-help books and different Christian theologians, and oftentimes they greatly want to avoid this idea of the yoke, right, that Jeremiah was prophesying about. Jesus in his ministry, he said, "Take my yoke upon you. My yoke is easy, my burden is light." The yoke is an image of the cross. And in our modern age, so many people in the church, they want to be like the prophet, the false prophet Hananiah, and say that we don't need to suffer, we don't need to bear the cross, we don't need to do different mortifications and penances. When it comes to things in our life that are hard or difficult, so many people want to find the easy way out. And yet Jeremiah shows forth the yoke of the cross. And Jesus did the same thing in his ministry. Don't run from the yoke. Take his yoke upon you. His yoke is easy and his burden is light. The cross for us is not just the times that we endure suffering. The cross is supposed to be a daily part of our life, offering things up to God. Little penances and mortifications, maybe getting up a little early, right, to come to daily Mass or spend time in prayer. Fasting throughout the week, right? Giving up a meal here or there, or sacrificing something else. We're supposed to take the cross and embrace it, not hide from it, not ignore it, and certainly not like the prophet Hananiah did, wanting to pretend like it doesn't exist, right? Or that it's not good for us. There's a lot we can learn from the story of Jeremiah and Hananiah.